I'm Emily, and I am here with Maya Murphy's attorney, Eva Marie Franco-Fox. Attorney Fox practices at Maya Murphy's office in Westport, Connecticut, and is admitted to practice law in both Connecticut and New York. My question today for Attorney Fox is, does Connecticut law treat prenuptial and postnuptial agreements the same?
That's a good question, Emily, and it's a commonly asked question. Generally, under Connecticut law, prenuptial and postnuptial agreements are governed by the same principles. However, postnuptial agreements are actually held to a heightened or stricter standard of scrutiny when being evaluated by the court. What does this mean? It means the courts presume that spouses are not contracting under the same conditions as non-spouses. And so they impose a higher level of scrutiny when evaluating these agreements as to whether or not they're enforceable. The courts presume that spouses are going to be less cautious with one another, perhaps more trusting of one another, and therefore more likely to be taken advantage of when negotiating a postnuptial agreement, as compared to individuals who are not yet married, and certainly as compared to individuals who are not negotiating a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement at all, meaning an individual who may be negotiating with a third party for a contract. Now, the courts presume that because these individuals are going to be less cautious, one may be more likely to be taken advantage of, and therefore the court, in an effort to ensure that everyone has gotten a fair and reasonable agreement, is going to apply this stricter level of scrutiny. So there are three elements that the court considers when evaluating or applying the stricter level. One, does the agreement comply with contract principles under Connecticut law? Two is, was the agreement fair and equitable at the time it was entered into? And the third is, was the agreement unconscionable at the time of dissolution or at the time the parties seek enforcement of the agreement? So the first element is fairly straightforward. Was the agreement compliant with standard contract law in Connecticut? Prenuptial and postnuptial agreements are contracts. So the court would determine if an agreement is not a valid contract, then therefore it's not a valid postnuptial agreement. The second element was the agreement fair and equitable at the time the parties entered into it. And for this analysis, the court is generally looking into two main things. Was the agreement voluntarily entered into? Meaning the court will analyze, were the parties under duress when signing? Were they coerced to sign? Were they under any undue influence? Were they fraudulently misrepresented or tricked into signing? Are there any defects as to whether or not a party knowingly and voluntarily entered into the contract? And the second factor is, were the parties given fair and reasonable financial disclosure? This means the parties need to have an understanding of what the amount, character, and value of their respective incomes, assets, and financial obligations are in order to determine were they given proper financial disclosure. Now, it's important to understand that without these elements being present, it's likely that a court will say the agreement was not fair and equitable at the time the parties entered into it, and therefore the agreement is not enforceable at the time the parties seek enforcement of it. The last factor, were the parties, was the agreement unconscionable at the time the parties seek enforcement or at the time of dissolution? It's important for the parties to understand that an agreement can be fair and equitable when they enter into it, but still be determined as it to be an unconscionable agreement when the parties are seeking dissolution. How can this happen? How can an agreement be fair and equitable when you enter it and then suddenly unconscionable when you seek to enforce it? There are different ways that this can happen. The most common way is that the court determines that the financial circumstances of the parties have changed so substantially since the time of execution and in such a way that the parties couldn't have foreseen, that now enforcing that agreement that was once considered fair and equitable would create a great injustice for one of the parties. And so if it's going to create this injustice, the court determines that the agreement is unconscionable and will not find the agreement to be enforceable. So these agreements certainly are both guided, prenuptial and postnuptial agreements are certainly guided by the same principles. So it's important to understand that a prenup also needs to be entered into voluntarily. A prenup also requires that the parties engage in fair and reasonable financial disclosure. The difference here is not these elements, it's the level of scrutiny that the court uses when evaluating these elements. So again, the postnuptial agreement is going to be subject to a higher or a stricter level of scrutiny when being evaluated by a court in Connecticut.